Hello, everyone, and welcome to Ventures, a show where my guests and I get to explore entrepreneurial stories, market landscapes, problem spaces, and examine together how new ventures might be able to be created, either for-profit, nonprofit, or personal ventures, to benefit humanity. Really, the purpose of this show is to educate and inspire a new generation of venture builders and venture investors to make the world a better place. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about all things software development, specifically web development. And my guests, Joe and David, are senior software engineers that have actually spent the last couple of decades doing very different things. Joe has been in the startup world building his own companies. David has spent over a decade at Amazon Web Services. He was one of the earliest employees at AWS. And so the insights that the two gentlemen in this episode today bring are extremely informative for us because there's a huge conversation if you're building a startup or you're thinking about investing in a startup around the software stack. What technology should you use? What are the trade-offs around performance and scalability and security? And how do you think about this conversation, especially as your startup begins to scale and you have to think about the different trade-offs with regard to your technology architecture. So this episode will be mainly for senior software engineers thinking about things, but if you are learning to code or are interested in the world of software development in general and web development in particular, this will be a helpful episode for you. And if you're a fellow investor listening in and are curious, have just a little bit more ammo when you're doing technical diligence on your investments, this will be a informative episode for you as well. So if you are listening to this episode, you can watch by visiting wclittle.com, and there you'll see more extensive show notes to the different topics that we talk about today. And if you are watching, you can also listen anywhere that you get your podcasts. You can just search for Ventures. So with that, please enjoy this conversation with David and Joe. All right, Joe, David, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Joe, if you wouldn't mind starting off, that would be that would be great. For a little background for the viewers and listeners, I have Joe and David are two of the software engineers that I respect and admire greatly, and I'm very excited for this show. So Joe, would you mind kicking us off and telling us a little bit about your background?
Sure. So going way back, I started programming probably when I was 11. And so I've been doing it ever since. I'm 40 now, so it's been a long time. But I've spent most of my career as a solo entrepreneur. And right out of college, I got a job as a software engineer, but I only did that for about 2 years because while I was doing that job, I started a little company on the side called Rails Playground. And just to give a little context, at the time, Ruby on Rails was just kind of coming out. And so there wasn't a lot of hosting options at the time. And so I put together, it was actually just a free service for people to try out Ruby on Rails. And I think it got on Hacker News, or Dig was still around then or something like that. And there was about 2,000 people signed up for a free account within a couple of days. And so then a little light came on. I was like, hey, if people want this for free, they're probably willing to pay for it as well. And then we started adding free plans. And then within probably 2 or 3 months, I was making more with my little side project than I was working as a full-time software engineer. So that was back in 2005. And so I've been self-employed now ever since 2005. And Rails Playground is still going on now, all this 15, 16 years later. And then kind of along that same lines, I've launched a couple other tools as well for software developers. One of them called sourcerepo.com and svnrepository.com, which predates Git and GitHub and all that kind of stuff. So I've always kind of been a self-funded bootstrapper type entrepreneur. So none of my businesses have been really huge, but at the same time, they pay all my bills, and I've been able to keep them small and keep them going all these years.
Awesome. Welcome. David?
Yeah. Let's see. What's my story? I really liked video games as a kid. Figured I'd make some. So I set out on a path to make video games, and I thought maybe I should learn how to write code. So I learned a little bit of Pascal, a little bit of Visual Basic. Then I realized that maybe I should finish high school, but that was overrated. Um, and I actually got a job, a summer internship at Majesco in high school, working on next generation consoles like Dreamcast and PlayStation 2, as well as some Game Boy stuff, and got my fill of the gaming bug. Uh, then in college, I kind of on the side joined a startup gaming company that had split off of Majesco's next gen gaming division, and we spent a few years trying to put together a game that we didn't quite get put together before we ran out of funding. So in college, I majored in computer science as well as English, trying to just fill all the requirements for gaming. And then when I was graduating, I started looking for something to pay the bills, and this book company was looking for software engineers. And I was like, "What?" So I interviewed with Amazon, and they offered me a position in something they wouldn't even tell me what it was until after I joined. So like 6 months later, after I'd signed the contract, I actually graduated and was able to go to Amazon and start working on the ground floor of AWS, which at the time nobody really knew anything about, because it didn't really was EC2, and that was it. And I started working on a project called Mechanical Turk, which was crowdsourcing, kind of an artificial intelligence alternative / training system. And I spent quite a few years in AWS, learning a lot of interesting things. It took my education a whole different level, learning about internet scale and 5, 6, and 7 nines of reliability, and the kind of things that matter when you're big that don't matter when you're small. So got a lot of learning there, a lot of exposure to a ton of different technologies, and had a lot of fun. And a few years ago, I left Amazon and joined Proda, and now I still play with a lot of different things, trying to keep everybody moving forward and making the right choices with technology and helping everybody succeed.
Appreciate that. So I'd love to start by exploring actually the teenage years. A lot of people listening in probably have teenagers or might be teenagers, really thinking about how to grow their skills as a programmer. So for each of you, what did those teenage years look like as you were learning how to code and tinkering around, and kind of what would be your advice for teenagers today? Joe, we'll start with you.
Sure. So this is going to date me a little bit, but when I was a teenager, I actually ran a BBS system.
Nice.
And that was one of my first businesses. So I had that going. And then in order to earn money to grow my business, I worked at McDonald's. And so I would funnel all my money that I made at McDonald's into my BBS system. And I also wrote shareware applications at the time for BBS systems, and was selling those online on FidoNet and all this kind of thing that none of the teenagers know what I'm talking about right now. But anyway, so I kind of had the entrepreneurial bug my whole life, basically. So even as a teenager, I had a software business going on. And at the time, I mostly learned from books, because, the internet was still young at that time. And I don't think I had internet access until I was like 16 or something like that. Before that, just the BBS systems. And then I did take one programming class in high school. Finally got to a place where they let me take a course there. But Like I had started before that and just learning on my own. I know there's a big debate right now over the formal education versus self-learning type thing for software engineers. Like, do you need a degree or not to be a good software engineer? And I think really for me, I think the answer is you need both, because you have to be a self-learner and a self-starter, I think, in order to succeed as a software engineer, because you can't just learn it all in 4 years. Like, it's an ongoing thing. If you don't keep learning, you're not going to be a good software engineer. So if I was a teenager right now, first look to see if your high school offered any classes, because formal education isn't a bad thing. As the teacher is probably going to know a lot of good stuff and be able to help you and mentor you along. I know I had a good teacher in high school, but then you also need to go out there and find things online, find courses online. I found the ones that we learn by example to be the most helpful, where they say, all right, this is what you need to do, now go do it. Because with software engineering, it's kind of like math. Like, you have to do it to be good at it. You can't just read about it.
How about you, David?
Yeah, no, I think you have to be passionate about something. You can't just be like, I want to make a lot of money, so I'm going to be a software developer. But if you're like, I want to do something and software is the thing that's going to help me do that, that's how you keep going, because it's not like read a book and then you're done. I was so frustrated back in like my early years with playing games and then picking up the code books and having the instructions and then showing me how to do it, and then the final result being crap. Just like not performant, like completely like on a different level, and being frustrated that no matter what I did, like somehow there were secrets involved in getting things better. I didn't learn until later that part of it was the languages that I was using, like Visual Basic, like just not going to perform game level. It's not going to do Quake, and even Pascal could maybe do it. Probably not. So part of it was just the tools that I had and the systems I was running weren't optimized for that. But part of it was, a mismatch between goals and experience as well. When I got into Majesco, for example, and learned more about how they did the low level coding in order to optimize certain things, and then I applied that back to my Rails and inline C and in Ruby. If you're trying to do some magical stuff like it, you can, it's almost like cheating to find out, oh, this is how they solve this. They don't actually just power through the way you think. So I think you have to manage your expectations carefully. The cool thing nowadays is that everybody who has internet access has access to best-in-class tools. The kind of things that we're probably going to talk about later weren't around, and the kind of low-level coding that I would struggle through just isn't necessary anymore. And I don't think it's even terribly helpful to try to learn a lot of that. You can learn the fundamentals, and then you can immediately take what's available at the high level and use that to fuel your passion. And then if you end up needing to optimize later, great. But like a lot of your things that you can accomplish, you can do. Find a project, find an objective, find a mud. or a choose your adventure game, or a manage your records for your sports teams, or pick something that you're passionate about and use that to learn. And that was my path in those early years. It was all about I did work on the mud, and once I found source code for somebody else's mud, that opened up whole new levels. That was the other thing, is if you're just trying to read the books, they didn't really tell you. They stepped you through, and at the end of the result, you got something that wasn't real. And if you were able to get access to some of this code, it was horrible and hard to read and didn't make any sense. And then once you delve into it, you're like, oh, but it actually works. And I think that was a really inspiring to be able to tweak something, see it change in something that was real and not just something that was an example.
I know in my own journey, I when I was in 8th grade, let's see, this would have been 1993 or 2 or 3 or somewhere in there. I remember building the school fight song in BASIC on an Apple computer, which basically just, a series of commands with tones at the frequency, at the length. And then, because I'd learned a little Logo in elementary school. I remember we actually had little programming classes even in the 80s. And, I'd done a little scripting on my TI-83 or TI-82 calculator. But it wasn't until high school I took a computer science class, AP Computer Science, which was in Pascal, that good old language, before everything switched to Java, I think. But I got absolutely destroyed in that class. And so that actually diverted me away from computer science into bioengineering in college. Before I got the results of my AP Computer Science test, I was actually thinking about going to Nintendo's vocational school to program. I think it was called DigiPen, to program computer games and go that path. But I had a variety of people tell me that was probably not a good idea. I could do that maybe later in life if I wanted to. And that combined with I think I got a 2 on my AP Computer Science test was like, all right, I'm gonna go be a bio nerd for a while. Eventually, my path kind of came full circle, and I learned PHP driven programming and got serious about building web apps. And my own journey crosses with Joe's, as we were both starting Rails hosting companies back in the day, and Joe's actually my upstream provider, and that's a whole fun story that we might get into it later at some point. But for the two of you, let's talk a little bit about just the last couple of decades. I know we could devote an entire podcast to this, but the last couple of decades of the evolution of the industry. And let's talk maybe specifically first with web development. Like, Joe, when you got maybe serious, let's maybe look at the early 2000s. Let's maybe start there. What were you up to, and kind of what were you diving into at the time?
Sure. So early 2000s was when I was at Clemson University. And so at the time, I don't know what they do now, but it was mostly Java. But they've kind of had me learn a little bit of everything. So I was learning Java, C++, a little bit of assembly, which, isn't really useful unless you're going to be a hardware engineer. But as far as web development goes, I was doing a little bit of Java web development and Perl and a little bit of PHP. And then as I took my first software engineering job in 2003, the company I worked for, they were a Java shop. And so it was all JSP and Java servlet-based things. But my boss at the time, he was using kind of a home-built framework, which was actually a little similar to what Rails was doing, because it had an ORM type system that he had built with a friend. And so that was my first ever hearing about that, because they didn't talk about that in college at the time. Object to relational modeling, which is where you take a database and map it to a programming object for those non-software engineers out there. But it just makes it easier to interact with the database and program. And so, but at the same time, Java is it's not the right language for most web applications. And so it was just a constant struggle to make it fit and to make everything work. And when I was working with Java at this company, there was a lot of prominent Java bloggers that kept talking about Ruby on Rails and how amazing it was, because it just provided all these tools and made web development so much faster and more efficient, because it had a lot of things already figured out for you. I think the motto was, convention over configuration. So like they just have best practices to follow, and all these things were already in place. And so after reading these articles, I was just kind of immediately on board with Ruby on Rails after dealing with JavaScript, not JavaScript, Java and JSP for so long.
How are you, David? What were you up to at the time?
Yeah, no, I mean it's been an interesting series of years. I think early 2000s. I had just discovered Ruby. We had most of the computer science courses were Java as the default, but I think it was a networking course, and they used Ruby, and I was like, this is interesting. I can do some cool stuff with this. It's way better than Perl. Because I can read it and understand it. It's not like I don't feel like I need to wear a wizard hat in order to write the code for it. So I actually used a CGI CGI Ruby ERB templating to generate a little web app that I was using internally to help connect students with other students and other resources that they were accessing the school. And so it was one of those, like, build your own web framework using some CGI and just ERB templates. And then along came Rails, and it's like, oh, they're doing what I'm doing, only they're putting a lot more effort into it. I'll just use theirs. And it was a nice, easy transition to do that. And then I started working at Amazon, and there's no Ruby, and I went on a little bit of a what's the word? Anyway, we worked to change that, but for many years it was struts and JSPs and or Perl. I was mostly trying to replace the Perl with Ruby. Ended up we started using a lot of Ruby on Rails instead of Java instead. But there's a progression there, and there's definitely some really big trade-offs that were happening. And it was interesting to see Java being deployed at a enterprise scale, and how that played in. And sometimes it was a lot nicer and easier to just plug in and write your little thing and rely upon all the dependency resolution and the things that we now have mostly solved in Ruby with Bundler, but which we did not have for many years, and where you could build stuff in Ruby and it wouldn't work the next day and you didn't know why, or it didn't work on your other developers thing. You're like, just copy my folders. that's not scalable. You never know when things would just fall apart. So I think there's this trade-off and this maturity that the Rails and Ruby on Rails has developed over the years that Java had early on, and it's matured in different ways as it's like all the different languages built on top of the JVM now, even Ruby if you're so inclined. So I think that's been an interesting journey. But I think in general, everybody all across the board has gone for less configuration, more convention, faster, more efficient, for respecting the idea that a software developer's time is worth something, which I think way back, even in the early 2000s, it wasn't as acknowledged as the primary cost wasn't the developer time, but it was the hardware and the software and the performance of the user. And as we've come along, we've realized, especially in the smaller things, that the amount of time you or me spend typing is way more expensive than the amount of time that our little slice of a virtual server sitting somewhere in the cloud runs. Right. Much cheaper.
So there was then some big shifts that came kind of toward the end of the 2000s. Obviously, the first iPhone was released, I believe, in 2007. Then all of us, we started dinking around with Objective-C and building little apps. We were all using jQuery at the time, sort of this framework on top of JavaScript. And then into the 2010s came kind of the beginnings of the single page application, the sort of reactive web apps where we started putting a lot of JavaScript into the browser to try to make things more fancy. How did you, Joe, did you in the SPA timeframe and even in the mobile timeframe, how did you think about, what were you learning? How were you thinking about things in that kind of 2007 and 2013 timeframe?
Well, in that time frame, I was still heavily pushing, Rails Playground and Source Repo and that kind of thing. And neither one of those projects really needed a single page app or mobile app or that kind of thing. So I was more just kind of playing around with those tools and not really using any of those professionally. I skipped over a lot of the single page React stuff in that whole time frame, to be honest with you.
Got it. Yeah. How about you, David?
Yeah. So I think when I think back about that time, the thing that, I mean, there was mobile as a thing, and there was a kind of a fork between mobile web and mobile apps, and you had to pick a path. Like who's going to win in some ways? Was it dedicated mobile clients, or was it this mobile web, this responsive, progressively enhanced websites that eventually are going to be just as good as the apps? And I think that as time progressed, that piece of it, I like to think that we are pretty clearly in most things work now as progressive web apps and not as like dedicated iOS apps. But there was definitely a season there where if you wanted to make, cash in big on the iTunes store, you had to dedicate yourself to learning Objective-C, and that really wasn't my game. I was on the periphery, and I worked with people to get things working on there, but I didn't find that to be the long-term bet that I was going to make. The other big transition, which when you talk about progressive web apps, for me it's the web component, the concept of bundling code on the client side in a modular way is, I think, a big fundamental mind shift, and it was really big to me because it enhances collaboration. If you're writing a web app, you're all by yourself, like whatever, put your code anywhere you want, write in whatever language you want, name your variables after the moons of Saturn. I don't know. But when you're trying to work with other people and trying to divide responsibility, web components, and specifically that gets into like the practical implementation, which was Angular version 1. I really loved how they were designed, and then they changed version 2, and it's a completely different beast. But React kind of filled in for me the gap there after Angular version 1, which was nice, clean things that you can take on their own and say, Joe is responsible for this piece. And Joe could trust that React component, when rendered on the page, would do what he had said, and it wouldn't be some, did I get my right hooks put into the application.js file that gets loaded right after jQuery, and did I get the right CSS loaded over here? It's like, no, this is my component. It's all bundled together, and I can kind of trust to some degree, and depending on how it's written, that it's going to do its thing, and I can make changes to the table display component, and it's not going to break login. So that was the other big shift, and I was super excited about that because it really helped me and a team of developers work more efficiently on larger, more complex web apps.
Got it. So from a pure, let's maybe take a moment for a pure education standpoint. We sort of dove right into a bunch of jargon, but at a very basic level, we'll talk about the web app world. At the very basic level, you send HTML, CSS, JavaScript from a server into a web browser, and the web browser brings that to life. And HTML sort of describes the parts of the document. CSS describes how those pieces are going to be styled and look. And JavaScript brings it to life and creates the dynamic nature of things and moving things around and sending data to and from servers. So from a pure education standpoint, the last 10 years especially, there's been all kinds of different frameworks on top of JavaScript or with JavaScript to try to make the process of building web applications easier, more scalable, more secure. And that's where frameworks like Rails have really helped out the ecosystem. So maybe, Joe, for you, as you built all your little companies here, did you build them all in the Rails stack? And how did you think about the different JavaScript frameworks as you were going?
Yeah, pretty much everything I built was on the Rails stack. And I don't know, like I just, as being a solo entrepreneur and my time being limited, I just never saw the value in the JavaScript frameworks because Rails had pretty much everything built into it already that I needed to use for as far as JavaScript is concerned. And I didn't need to build, a really fancy reactive application at that particular time. And then I also kind of in that time period was doing a lot in PHP as well. And with that, I was still using PHP and jQuery and Smarty templates, and I'm still doing some of that today too. Because PHP, a lot of people talk bad about it, but Slack just sold for $1 billion or billions of dollars, right? And they have a PHP backend. So right. I don't think PHP can be ignored. It's a very powerful tool.
Right. Yeah.
But more recently, when I was coming up with my last business, Taskbill, then I did take a step back and I looked at all the different JavaScript frameworks at that time to try to figure out, okay, what's the best tool right now in 2020 to build this application that I'm starting from ground zero. I don't know if I skipped ahead too much.
No, it's fine.
Okay, so in 2020, when I was looking, okay, so what is the current state of Rails right now? What's the current state of all these Java frameworks? And do I want to learn React right now? Or like what happened to Ember and what happened, to all these different things that I had kind of learned off and on through the years since I last built a new Rails application. Because the last Rails application I had built from scratch before then had been a few years ago, before all this was available. And so I kind of just stumbled upon a new tool set called StimulusReflex. And StimulusReflex kind of did away with the need of the JavaScript heavy framework and did something called HTML over the wire instead. Instead of using a big JavaScript framework, you write everything in Ruby and the kind of things that you know already, and it takes care of doing the magic to make the app look reactive. And I think, really when it comes down to it, for anyone that's starting an app and wanting to develop themselves, it's like, what tools do you and your partners know the best is really what it comes down to. And so it was just me developing it and say, what do I know about? Well, that's Ruby, and it's certainly not React because I've never used it before. So if I was going to use React, maybe it would take me 5 or 6 months. And instead, I had MVP done within like a month and a half for Taskbill.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I remember learning Angular 1 and becoming disillusioned with Angular 2. I remember learning Ember. Even before that, I even wrote some tutorials on Backbone.js to kind of tinker with, am I going to advise? Because at this point, like 2009 and 2014, I was investing in startups and helping entrepreneurs decide what technology stack to use. And for those years, it was a big question mark, which JavaScript framework to go after. Hey, and it really fundamentally, like you said, came down to what were the developers on those teams most comfortable with? Because at the end of the day, your speed of shipping code in early stage startup land to meet the demands of customers, it makes or breaks a company. So, but then, like David mentioned earlier, React came along, and in my opinion, when I started building with React and kind of understanding state management with Redux, it became, in my mind, like case closed. I'm going to stop dinking around with Ember and Backbone and Angular, and for very, very rich reactive single page applications, I'm going to double down on React. So that's really been the last, 4 or 5 years now. And I'm curious, David, so for it might be good to maybe back up a moment. Your experience with Amazon Web Services for over a decade. Let's maybe start with, what did you learn through that season? And that probably will inform how you're thinking about the StimulusReflex versus Redux React and kind of what we're seeing in progressive web apps. And so I'm curious to kind of maybe start with, what did you learn in that AWS season as AWS was growing?
Yeah, I mean, I learned a ton. So I'm not sure I could iterate and go through everything I learned. But some of the unique things that I think that you don't get unless you work at a big company that is hiring rapidly and growing rapidly. You don't understand, or at least it's hard to understand the need to have code bases that new people can jump into and contribute right away. The need to have so there's this developer needs that you have, not just to follow convention, because that's good, but you also need to be able to, once you get beyond the simplistic, this is an app and it's a website, it's showing them 3 models. People have to be able to know where to go, what to do, and how to add and change and diagnose things. So there's a lot of developer just ease of use that is required, and honestly, Rails does a good job of this, because where things are supposed to be. Like, their conventions are pretty strong, whereas something like struts doesn't really force people to put things in the right spots. Or even React, if it's a full SPA by itself, doesn't and especially hasn't had really solid conventions about how to organize things, where to put your data, how deep should your Redux tree be, what type of objects, what type of immutability should you use, like how do you organize your callbacks. Like, these are things that there's not a solid convention, and so it's painful sometimes if you have your best engineers are hired away to work at startups every 6 months, and you're hiring 3 new engineers, and 2 of them are probably going to survive at least 6 months, and then one of them's probably not, and you need to be able to take have those people contribute in a meaningful way to multiple applications. And so that whole thought process of, how do I ensure that a team can make substantial value transfer without a bunch of localized, specialized knowledge is very important to think about. I think the other thing to think about that I thought about AWS is that scale was completely different than anything I've seen before. It's not 3,000 users, it's like 300,000 users. It's not 40 requests per hour, it's 40 requests per second. And when you're dealing at that level, machine costs do play a role. It's not trivial anymore if you're like, oh, just add a few more servers. That said, it is very important that you can have that option to say, just add a couple more servers. Right. That one of the worst things possible that you can get into is a situation where you can't just add money. Because sometimes you can't hire that amazing engineer that you want to hire to re-architect your event-based notification system to ensure that customers getting updates at the right time. And if you didn't architect it right to begin with, you can't just say, we'll just pay more. Right? If you build something, and that's one thing that AWS as a service provider offers startups and is these scalable building blocks. Right? If you throw all your events into SQS or some queue that you don't have to own, then you can just pay more and it gets bigger and it works faster, and you can add more hosts to process at the end your Kinesis stream or whatever. But if you've architected in such a way that you don't really have that scalability, you get to a point where it's like, oh, I'm so successful. I have 1,000 people. They all want to buy my widget at the same time, but they can't. And nothing I can do other than spend time to fix my problem is going to solve it. And you lose out. So that's the other real big thing I learned was you need to be able to scale with money and not time. Which is, it's hard, and it's not always something you can plan ahead of time. And sometimes I advise when you're first, throwing together an idea, that's not the time to make the thing that scales perfectly. But so you have to balance that and be willing to just throw away what you have if it's not going to work. Because sometimes it's just not going to work once you get to that point. But you got to be able to test your ideas before you know whether to invest in your ideas, if and when possible.
So then with regard to the classic question around scalability, the does Rails scale question, as entrepreneurs, developers, either internally in a large organization or deciding what stack to use to build. And, it's been big debate over the last couple decades around this question. I'm curious, maybe we'll start with you, Joe. How do you typically answer that? I mean, obviously you've built a bunch of companies in the Rails stack, and have been able to make a living off of it. But how in the does Rails scale question, and what stack should I use? How do you typically approach that conversation?
Well, I think, first of all, most of the time, it doesn't really matter, because for most of these companies, they're not going to be on the scale of AWS. So first of all, you have to ask that question, like how many people are going to use this application? Because, there's a lot of the freelance stuff that I do is internal tools, for example. And so these are only ever used by, 3 people at a time. So does it matter if that scales? No. But does the shopping site scale? That side, that's more important that runs fast and that can be scaled up. But at the same time, just in general, I don't have any personal experience with this, but I would point people to look at some of the giant Rails applications out there, like Shopify, for example, is run on Rails. GitHub is run on Rails. And those are huge companies that are scaling on Rails.
Yeah, and Basecamp, the founder of Rails,
Basecamp, of course,
part of Basecamp, which is pretty big. But obviously, there's a difference. There's AWS scale, and scale means different things to different people. But yeah, no, that's a good word. How about you, David? How do you generally approach the conversation around does Rails scale? What stack to use? How would you advise people?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple things. I think the question that has been asked for the last 10 years about does Rails scale, it seems like such a lame question to me. Because at the end of the day, we talk about does it scale efficiently, right? What's your cost per? Because Rails as a back-end application server is a piece in an architecture, and as long as you can add more servers, then it scales in as much as you have money to scale it, right? Now, if your users are worth less than 10 cents a click, and it costs you 10 cents per click to run the servers, you might not have a good economic model there. And so again, it's all about the workload, all about what you're trying to accomplish. But there's so much more to scalability than just how many clicks per second can I handle. And I think that's part of why the way the question isn't a very good one, right? Rails, again, as a back-end service, I don't care in your architecture that much. I look at your architecture, I say, oh, look, your architecture is a dumb web app. Users click buttons on your website, that sends a web request, they get a response, and it renders a whole new page. That may or may not be snappy and responsive, and it's going to be more or less snappy depending on how many servers you have relative to how many users, but just one server and one user, if it takes 3 seconds to load each page click, nobody's going to like that. And that's not scalability. That's just straight up performance. And that's not fixable if your web app is going to take 3 seconds to reply to one user when it's not under load. And so you have to think, well, what am I doing in those 3 seconds? Why am I doing that? Can I break it up? Can I make, magic happen? And that's what happens when you go from Rails, the backend web server, to Rails, the experience, right? Where you have action cable and you have all the other tools you have on the front end that are kind of negotiating and making the magic happen, to where you're like, oh, it just feels responsive, and that's great. And then you start multiplying your costs of scaling the servers on the back end up, because your tricks are actually resulting in 10 requests per click instead of 1 request per click. But again, if it's 3 users and they're paying you $50 a month, you can afford to dedicate a single host to them, and you make a lot of money. If it's 3 users, they're paying you $20 a month, and you need 3 hosts in order to support normal behavior. Like, that's probably, again, an economic problem. But yeah, I think scalability is about the whole ecosystem. It says, what is going on this page? Is it making 1,000 200 millisecond requests every time they scroll their window around? Like, you can write really unscalable JavaScript on the front end if you're trying to track mouse movement and send that back to the server. And it's like, oh, who would do that? Yeah, you'd be surprised. And you can do that efficiently, but you can also do that really inefficiently. Yeah, so that's, I don't know if that answered your question.
Touched on a really important point. Yeah, no, you touched on a really important point that we didn't really talk about in the history, and that's really in the last, well, I guess it's been kind of 10 years, and this whole idea of serverless, or a services-oriented architecture. It basically started with services-oriented architectures, and now more recently, it's this kind of serverless concept. David, do you want to talk a little bit about what those two things are and how developers are thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's kind of like, originally we just had this idea of servers that, you'd lease a server in a co-location, or you'd buy one and plug it in yourself, and it would run, an application, and people would come to it on the web, and they'd connect to it, the HTTP, Git, and retrieve a page, right? That was kind of the original architecture. You draw an architecture diagram, it'd be a picture of a server and a cloud, and then the picture of the user's computer. And the only way you could scale that was add more servers. It wasn't really a lot of nuance there. And it became less efficient, and just not the right mix when you started growing in complexity of your applications. And it turned out that maybe authenticating users needed to be really fast and reliable and locked down and secure, but like the way that they played their game didn't need to be that secure, or you needed to scale resources to support real-time message transfer and chatting, but you didn't need to scale resources to support rendering your marketing pages. So we came up with more interesting architectures. And one of those switches was saying, well, I'm going to break my single server application into lots of different servers that all do different things. I'm going to authenticate to auth.myorg.com, and I'm going to, fetch my my business reports from reports.whatever.com. And then if my authentication service is having issues, it's not going to affect my reporting service. And if my reporting service needs to run and have a lot of long running database connections, it's not going to nuke my authentication service because it's using a different pool, maybe even different hosts, and a completely different set of permissions. So you could modularize your systems, and I could have a different team working on, making sure that the authentication service worked and had all the authentication related features. and scaled appropriately to itself without having to think about the reporting service or some of your main business functions. And that's kind of in a nutshell, the service-based architecture. It allowed a lot of flexibility to scale different parts independently, which really helps when you're large and doesn't help at all when you're teeny. It's a total waste of your time.
Got it. Yeah. So then what is serverless then? This is kind of a buzzword, and it's kind of all the rage right now. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, as I mentioned, originally you'd have to lease space in a co-location thing because you didn't have, gigabit internet coming into your house, and you needed somewhere that actually had internet, right? And then AWS came along, and you could just lease virtual machines in the cloud, EC2, yay. But then we started wanting smaller pieces of consumable compute power. You'd have all these service-based architectures. You'd have 32 different services, and you're like, wait a minute, I'm paying $30 a month for each of these services, and or 60 because I need 2 machines to be redundant, and they only need a pocket watch worth of computing power. What am I doing? And so the one of the answers there, besides just smaller virtual hosts and slices of virtual hosts, is serverless. And serverless was saying, well, wait, I don't really need a server with a shell and a process that I can log into and all that stuff. I just need my application to run somewhere, and I don't care where it runs. So how about somebody else just runs my application for me, or my code for me, and I don't have to worry about it. And that's in a nutshell. You take a piece of code, you hand it to somebody like AWS, and they stick it in their Lambda service, and they run it. When users from the web call an endpoint, they execute your code. Are there servers involved? Absolutely. Are they your servers? No. Do you pay for a server to sit in a co-located facility somewhere all month? No. You pay for on demand. It's kind of like having an Uber instead of a car, right? You don't own your car. You just call Uber whenever you need something. If you drive a lot, Uber's probably not the most economical thing. But if you're like, I only drive, I'm in the city, I drive, it's a 3-minute drive, and I do it on the weekends, like, get Uber. That's a better deal for you than owning a car and having to maintain it when you're, in a city and you may not have a secure parking garage. So that's kind of the model there. Is like, instead of having to maintain and organize and manage a bunch of machines and updates and whatnot, just say, let someone else manage that. It's almost like if you take Heroku's model of upload my code and run it in a container. We've taken that, and then we've taken it one step further.
That's good. That's good. So Joe, I'm curious, what are you learning now in the StimulusReflex? You've built Taskbill in this stack. What maybe start by telling the viewers and listeners what is Taskbill, and then talk a little bit about kind of how you've been building on this new stack.
Sure. So Taskbill.io is the website. And what it is a tool for freelancers and agencies to track your billable hours and invoice your clients for those hours at the simplistic level. I had built a tool kind of similar to this to use for myself, for my own freelancing business, because there are a lot of other tools available that do similar things, but none of them kind of work the way that I wanted them to work. And in the past, I found the businesses that have worked well for me is, scratch your own itch. Like, what is missing that I need? And I build it for myself. And most of the time you find out, oh, well, there's other people that have that same problem or had those same issues with similar tools. And so Taskbill, I started building that. The idea being really tight integration with Asana, first of all, which is a project management software similar to Basecamp. We also support Basecamp as well, but initially I just focused on Asana because that's what I used personally in my own freelance projects. And I just wanted to be able to not have to think too much about my time tracking either. I just wanted to be able to be in Asana, click a button saying I'm working on this task right now. And then when I'm done, click another button. And now that time is logged and I can bill my client for that down the road. And I also wanted to be able to, send out invoices and not have to spend a lot of time on that either, and figure out, oh, which tasks have I billed for now? Which hours have I billed for? Because Taskbill will take care of that all for me. It keeps track of which hours and tasks that I've already billed for. So just once a month, or every couple of weeks, or however often you want to do it, you just go in and say, okay, what have I worked on for this particular client that I need to invoice for? It shows you everything. It emails it off to them. They pay you, and you go on your merry way. And like we were talking about earlier, I built that using the latest version of Rails and Stimulus and StimulusReflex. There's also another tool that it relies heavily on called Cable Ready, which is kind of like a helper library built on top of Action Cable, which is a built-in Rails library. It just allows you to basically update a website in real time from your Ruby code. Like, you can select a small section of the website saying, I want to put a different thing right here. You just tell it that, and it just changes it automatically. Where normally you'd have to write a bunch of JavaScript on the front end to call back to your server and say, hey, what do you need me to do? And then, oh, I need you to do this, to go do this. Where now you just go on your back end. So, for example, when you start a timer, it sends an action cable/cable ready request out that starts the little timer. When you click the stop button, it records the time and then sends the request back out. And so in all of the dashboards, everything updates in real time. All the latest hours is all done with Cable Ready without having to write really a single line of JavaScript to power a lot of that stuff, which just saved a lot of time in development, because I was able to get an MVP out fairly quickly of this, probably like a month and a half of development. And then, of course, with any MVP, then once you start getting your customers, you start getting feedback.
Okay.
And then, as you alluded to earlier, you need to be able to take action on that feedback really quickly. And that's how you gain customers and really advocates for your business too, because most people are used to dealing with larger companies where they say, hey, Asana, like, you should really add this feature. I need it for my business. And they'll say, like, oh, that's cool. Well, maybe we'll add that someday. Where you're dealing with a small startup and they're one of your first 3 customers, and they say, hey, we really need this feature for our business. It's important to us. You can go and say, okay, well, I'll do that for you. And if you use the right tools and you're comfortable with it, you can go in there, and it takes a couple of hours. And then all of a sudden you have a customer that's going to tell other people about how amazing your customer support was, that they added this feature for you almost within days or instantly, which would never happen at a large organization.
So the creator of Rails, DHH, he is alluding to this new magic that might be upcoming. What do you think that is? Is that going to be like StimulusReflex, or what are you anticipating us seeing here later this year or early next year?
Yeah, so this new magic stuff is really interesting because it all goes back to this new service that they came out with called Hey.com, which is a competitor to Gmail, where the idea of being more focused on your privacy, because really a lot of things are going to privacy focus these days. If you use Gmail, sure, it's free, but you're the product. They're analyzing all your data and your emails and that kind of thing. Or Hey, where they were like, hey, I think people will pay $100 a year to not have ads and not have someone look at my stuff. So anyway, they came up with they're a small team. I think they've got maybe 30 people in the organization or something. And I think they said they had like 6 to 10 engineers built this product. And they're very good about contributing to the open source world, obviously, with Ruby on Rails. So they developed this new technology to focus on HTML over the wire instead of using a heavy JavaScript framework like React, which is very similar to StimulusReflex and Cable Ready. They've been a little bit secretive about what it is and that kind of thing and what it's going to do, but I think it's going to be very similar to what we're seeing in Cable Ready and Reflex, where you write a lot of the code in Ruby instead of JavaScript, and the new magic is going to create that JavaScript for you, where all the requests are going to be handled by the server. and HTML is going to be rendered on the server, and then all the JavaScript really does is then just display the pre-rendered code. Excuse me. So that does, as far as scalability goes, that could create a problem in larger applications because you're going to be relying more on your server now, right? Because it's going to have to generate all that HTML for every request. But I think, for most projects, a lot of people spend a lot of time on, like I was saying earlier, internal tools. And so what can you be most efficient at for your company in creating these internal tools? And I think HTML over the wire is definitely the answer for those kind of tools. And we'll see long term how it goes towards big applications where they're showing that it's scaling with hey.com. I don't know how many people are using it, but it's a good bit.
David, what's your take on this? What do you expect to see out of new magic? Obviously there are a lot of potential pitfalls here. I'm curious to get your commentary on pitfalls on this approach and kind of what you're expecting to see here.
Well, I have my hopes. I haven't been following too deeply the leaks and the details, and haven't looked at the hey.com source code terribly deeply. So I can't say for sure. But one thing I've noticed, and a paradigm perhaps that web development has kind of shifted back and forth through. When we were first writing web pages with just HTML, it was declarative. You would write out your HTML, and that's what the user saw. And if you want to make changes, you could change your HTML on the server, and it would change directly. And every single time the user reloaded the page, it was still that way, right? You made the change, it was effective, and it happened. And similarly, like Rails comes along, and now we have dynamic pages. But for any given situation with a straight Rails app, you reload the page, and it's going to render the same HTML, right? And I think that's something that StimulusReflex has actually enabled well. And it's also something that frameworks like React have really doubled down on, which is this way to write declarative code, as opposed to imperative or procedural code, where you'd use jQuery to modify your page and do this and that. When they click it, you'd have a big long jQuery series of commands to make things slide up and down and do all this other crap. It was very hard to follow, to debug, to modify without breaking things. And what we've shifted to, going from jQuery to React, is similar to how we've shifted from some of this other stuff. Like StimulusReflex has mostly provided the same idea of I write my template, my HTML template once, and then depending on how exactly I use that tool, I've been able to play with it and use it in a way that's declarative, and that when there's a reflex action happening, it just magically re-renders the page, and I don't have to think about what it's re-rendering. It just does it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's that piece of magic that I see. I'm hoping that's the essence of this new magic, is not that we have more tools to procedurally tweak things, but that we can just stop thinking about tweaking things and think more about displaying our data in a declarative way, such that when things change and wiring up and declaring that when things change, I want to call my server, but then when my server does stuff, I just want it to reflect those changes without having to think about it, without having to optimize, without having to write special handlers and JavaScript controllers for particular actions to tweak and choose which piece of my page I want to change. I'd like that to just magically update, and so that's my my hope.
That's your hope. What are the pitfalls then? What can go wrong? I know that's a huge question. Maybe to hone the question a little bit here, for the developers that are considering waiting or using StimulusReflex and maybe using magic for their new project, what are the potential pitfalls? What are things to be aware of as they think about performance and scalability and security?
I mean, obviously, anything that's new hasn't been vetted as well, and you never know when there's going to be some weird edge cases that people discover that let you connect to iPhones over Wi-Fi and completely own them. It's just like, all right, but that kind of stuff happens more frequently with new code. So whether or not there is, this new magic or even StimulusReflex, if there's issues or security things that need to be locked down that aren't locked down by default, that is a problem when you get bigger, and obviously not a problem with your internal small team tool, right? One hopes. Again, it depends on if it's out there on the web and everybody can now access your TPS reports. That might be a problem. But the other real thing is when you're scaling, and scaling sometimes doesn't mean Amazon scale. Sometimes it means, your manager and your manager's boss both loading the page at the same time. That can sometimes be a scaling issue. Or another type of scaling issue is when somebody's loading your tool on their iPhone and they don't have the best reception. They're on 3G somewhere and they're a little slower, or they're memory constrained. And sometimes these tools, they spin up a lot of stuff. React can be a little heavy on the CPU, a little heavy on the RAM compared to some of this other HTML replacement. Virtual DOM doubles almost the RAM requirements in some cases. Whereas, if you're just sending HTML over the wire and immediately updating it, that's easier on the client host from a resource perspective. But if those updates take even 300 or 400 milliseconds, and you're expecting it to behave, so if I want a button and I want to click on it and it's going to change color, and it's native, it's going to change color when I click on it. And if it's that color change is actually driven by some back and forth with the server. If you're on a 3G connection and it takes 300 or 400 milliseconds to respond, your client is going to be very confused. They're going to click the button. It's not going to happen for half a second. They're going to just be like, why is your UI so leggy? So that could lead to bad customer experiences. There are tricks, right, to make. There are tricks for anything, right? But the problem is once you start applying the tricks, once you start doing specialized optimizations, you lose your magic, in the sense that, something like StimulusReflex, when you're using it in its basic form, it's magical for the developer experience. It's very clear what's happening. Everybody wins. But then when you're like, oh, but now it needs to perform on a 3G network. And oh, look, I did a bunch of stuff I shouldn't have done because it's now super leggy and not responsive. And the user's like, why is your site so slow?
Right.
And so the answer then is, the StimulusReflex person will be like, oh, I can fix that. I'm just going to go in and write a JavaScript, what is it? A reflex controller, I think, or, there's all these different real fixes that you can make. But once you've made a bunch of those fixes, you realize you spend 10 times as much time, and B, like, it's no longer the nice, clean, easy to follow, beautiful code that you had to begin with. So there's some question there. The other trade-off that you have is the cost of, per customer. If your service is something that's ad supported, if it's something that's trying to scale, as opposed to something that's subscription based, you really do need to think about how much is my hosting costing. You can't run a production service on a single server. It's just, unless you're willing to have it randomly die and go offline at any given time, which is not a reasonable thing for anybody who's trying to be professional to do. So you need at least 2 servers behind a load balancer if you're running a standard Rails application. And then the question becomes, how many more servers do you need, and how much is that going to cost to support your user base? And you compare to if I spent more time, and a lot of the most simple React apps, the SPAs, can be hosted for free as static HTML. Right. Like absolutely no cost until you start persisting data, and then it's only the data that you're persisting. And so if you're just persisting data locally. And, you can use a user's local storage. You can, and then synchronize it to your cloud store occasionally. You can build something that's phenomenally cheaper on a per user basis. Whether or not that makes sense is, again, very use case dependent.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, I invested in a company that helps people who are broadcasting their video streams, like mainly for gamers. And they, open broadcast software and other software for gamers that are streaming their games often require very CPU and memory and GPU and memory intensive hardware setups. So this company that I invested in moved all of that to the cloud to allow a lighter infrastructure on the streamer side of things. So it sounds like this is actually probably where we're going with the new magic. It's probably just taking kind of the RAM and CPU that would have been on the client side and just shoving it back over onto the server side. And so it's interesting to think about that, at the end of the day, you're going to have CPU and GPU and memory issues somewhere. It's just a matter of, are you putting that on the client, or are you moving that to your own server architecture? So I think fundamentally, even if we're writing in StimulusReflex and whatever new magic is, we're going to have to create kind of that spinner, this is loading kind of experience that we would have to kind of inherently have to do with React anyway. And that's kind of my own investigation in it, is these stimulus controllers are really, that's the logic around the life cycle before the call, during the call, after the call, and the JavaScript that's required to basically create user experiences that they would expect, even if they're on a slow connection. So I think this is a really interesting conversation. I think the two of you approach it from very real and fascinating different perspectives. I think this is probably a good place to wrap up. So why don't we any final words? So the people listening in, they're probably at this point mostly either medium to senior software engineers. But for those of you that are listening or watching that have made it this far, I commend you. Maybe any final thoughts when people are thinking about what stack should I use? Is this going to scale? Or maybe there's an investor listening in that's wondering from a diligence perspective, is this team doing something and using a stack that makes sense? Any final words for those audiences? Joe, we'll start with you.
I would just go back to, what is your team comfortable with? What do you know the best? Because if anybody on your team has to learn a new tool, that's just going to slow you down. So, what does your lead developer know the best? I guess you should start there. And what can they build you with the fastest? Especially if you're an early stage startup, you got to just get that thing out the door, even if you're embarrassed by it. You got to get feedback as quickly as possible. So if you're coming from that approach, you just got to look like a developer efficiency. What can I do the fastest? What's going to make my developers happy? And generally, most of the time, that's Ruby on Rails. And it's just a different conversation if you're coming from an enterprise level where you're building a huge enterprise application, then it's just a whole nother conversation. So I think it just depends where you're coming from. But if you're just starting out, if you're not working for anybody, if you're just trying to learn, I would go with the framework, because that's going to help you stay on the right path, even if it's not Ruby on Rails. Like if you want to use PHP, and like Laravel is hugely popular right now, and it's very comparative to Ruby on Rails. Or there's Elixir, and Phoenix Live View is very similar to what's happening with StimulusReflex. It was inspired by Live View. So there's stick with a framework if you're coming off this, just starting, for sure.
It's good. How about you, David? Any final words for these various audiences that are thinking about this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, if you're a developer and you're looking to, like, what should my skill set be? Like, you should have something that you know well, and you should have dabbled in everything. Because if you're an entrepreneur and you're starting up and you're doing it all yourself, like, you get to pick. But if you're doing it for somebody else, you don't get to pick. And it'd be nice to not be the guy slowing down the team because you don't know something. But your first fundamental thing is, like, know enough of one stack, of one tool set to like get things done. And that will help you learn the others. It'll help you understand. I have a couple different basic, play apps that I can build in many different languages, and I do build in everything new that I'm learning. I just this weekend I picked up Redwood.js, which is a very interesting up and coming framework. On the other side, if you're a JavaScript developer and you want something like Rails that kind of holds your hand and kind of puts all the things in the right place, that looks very promising. Although its deployment and long term, it's still heavily developed at the moment. But it doesn't matter what stack you learn. You should have one that you're like, I feel really good about, and then you should understand when you might want to use the other ones. I think as far as a due diligence on is this team got an app that is the right fit for their startup, their company, you really have to be careful. There's no one size fits all. If it's an early stage startup that is trying to find product market fit, they're not targeting like this super high scalability right away. I need 1 million people looking at my website. Then they're probably fine in whatever they're building, even if they are trying to target that. But they're first trying to vet things. It is a very reasonable thing for an early stage startup to build something and throw it away once they have the money and they've vetted the idea and they're ready to scale and pump money into it. You don't want to pump money into something that doesn't scale. If you can help it, that doesn't help anybody. But I think there's a lot of different approaches, and there are certain architectural patterns separating out the client, the server, and some of these other things that will enable a lot cheaper and easier scaling. And so I'm much happier to see a company or a startup that has done that, provided they again can still be responsive, which is very important, and that they need to have expertise in whatever tool they're using. If they're like, I'm using this because you guys said it was awesome, but I don't know how to use it, like that's not helping anybody. So yeah, those are my thoughts.
It's good. Gentlemen, appreciate your time. Joe, where can people find you online?
Probably Twitter would be the best place, at J Clarke, JClarke. And then be sure to try out Taskbill.io if you're a freelancer or an agency.
Sweet. How about you, David?
You can't find me.
All right. Well, if you want to get a hold of David, you can email me at will@wclittle.com, and I will continue the conversation. Obviously, David and I work together at Proda, and Joe's part of our network. We have all sorts of interesting collaboration in the pipeline that I'm excited to share with you all. So, Joe, David, thank you. This has been a great conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Great talking with you, Will.
Bye.
All right, a couple quick things before you go. Number one, I have a general newsletter where I write about technology and startups, and health science, and teaching people to code. And I write about a variety of different subjects that we talk about on this show. So if you go to wclittle.com, there you'll be able to subscribe, and you'll also be able to subscribe to particular topics. If you're just interested in one or a few of them, you'll be notified right when I publish new content in those areas. Number two, my partners and I at Proda Ventures have a portfolio company called Startup Rocket. If you go to startuprocket.com, there you'll be able to receive coaching guides and customize an operations framework for you and your team and your advisors to be on the same page in terms of what is the appropriate next step for you and your entrepreneurial journey. And finally, if you wouldn't mind leaving a review anywhere that you have listened to this podcast or watched this podcast, it'd be super helpful to help those who might be interested in consuming this content as well. Thank you.